Welcome back to the Carry Handle Podcast. My name is Bryce, and with me, as always, is Kevin. How you doing, buddy?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me on.
You're very welcome. So, what are we talking about this fine evening?
We're talking about modernizing the AK-47 platform and bringing it up to modern day standards.
Now, when we talk about modern day standards, what in your mind makes it modern?
I'm thinking rails, sight, uh, sight, fuck, options.
Site options. So, more specifically, would you like to say enablers or the ability to maintain zero with modern day optics
Modern day
and
optic.
light lasers, designators, things like that?
Yes, and move away from that god awful PSO garbage, garbage optic.
Okay. So we have been talking about AKs on and off. I've mentioned them a number of times on this podcast, and I was just thinking it'd be kind of cool if I could just nerd out and talk about something that I've recently become kind of interested in. I'm not the know-it-all about AKs. It's not something that I know. It's not something I obsess about. It's something I've recently, Kevin, recently become interested in and or more interested in. And
Recently.
so I've kind of flip flopped back what guns I plan on buying, and I finally started getting parts for one, so I've decided I'm going to do it. I want to talk about what you have to look forward to or what you should expect if you buy an AK and want it to perform like a out of the box AR that you can buy from Daniel Defense or you can buy from BCM or you can buy from LMT. Any of these rifles that we kind of take for granted now just because it's so plug and play in terms of setting them up for night vision, setting them up for close quarters, 300 yards and out. Because
Well,
basically it's Legos. I mean, you can do whatever you want with an AR. What does it take to do that with an AK? Short answer, it doesn't work like that. It
well,
doesn't work.
it's almost like imagining having Windows operating system and then wanting to use Linux operating system as a Windows operating system for all you
Yep.
computer geeks out there.
Yeah, no, see, I that's a good analogy, but I want to start off by saying I love AKs, I love guns in general. But if you want all these things and you're not really interested in about nerding out about certain parts to make something do something else, buy an AR, buy a Galil, buy
Galil.
a Galil Ace. I'm sorry, a Galil Ace.
Drop 2 grand on a Galil Ace and call it a day.
Okay, so you want to bring up price tag. That's fair. So what are you going to drop on an AK to bring it up to these standards? So I think we can kind of dive into that. And then the price associated, you're going to end up spending Galil
Great.
Ace money or more to get this rifle to do what you want it to do when you could just buy a $1,300 AR and then just throw all the parts of that and not have to worry about rail systems, gas tubes, and all the things that you would need to have it work. So I know a lot of people really like AKs because of their reliability, and it's a very iconic look. And there's a lot that goes. It's very evocative. So
Oh,
and I can understand that, but if you're actually just pulling a trigger, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But if you want to have some fun and
yeah.
just dump absurd
Oh,
amounts of money into it,
absurd. So
it's a
much
little bit more.
you have to have a second account to hide from bread.
No, unfortunately, she's aware of my shopping habits. So it's just something that you're going to have to be aware of going into it. It's like modernizing an MP5. They're great guns, but
They
they
are.
are outdated. They're very outdated. They're cool, and I love them, and I want one, but they're very outdated. If I wanted a modern sub gun, get an MPX. It's very easy.
So that's
So
the price. I just sent you something I found on Gunbroker. That's kind of the price point that the Galil Aces are going
yeah, they're 2K plus, right?
for. 1900.
Okay, well, so I mean, just getting into it with a Galil before we even start talking about AKs, and I know people are already saying Galils aren't AKs. They are. It's an AK. Same thing, long stroke piston. For all intents and purposes, they were designed based on an AK.
Wait, they're
Israelis
AK?
just there. It's an AK. That's the first generations were just 5.56 AKs. That's all they are. Nothing fancy. They're really cool, but they're AKs. That's all they are. That's
Uh,
not to say that they're not good rifles, obviously, but
yeah.
I mean, $2,000 is basically what you're going to get it to, and I would argue that's way easier getting into a Galil. It's plug and play. It's almost a turnkey updated AK, because here in America we can't get Kalashnikov concerned AK-100s, AK-200s, AK-12s, 15s, or any of the perceived updates that are coming out of countries that we can't get because we have to have parts kits and they're not factory and things like that. So, what does an American consumer have to do to update the AK? And even then, I would say that, but some of the things we're going to go over later are being used by people that use AKs. So, in terms of like Russian alpha groups, they use a lot of the things we're going to talk about. And some of the things we're going to talk about, like the rail systems and the chassis,
Oh,
are
the
being employed by alpha group guys because they work on rifles like AK-74s, AK-100s, AK-200, maybe not 200s, but they're
well,
using those on those rifles.
if you would take a moment to look at the what I'm sending you now, I think that would be a great starter buy if you want to do a modernized AK. So Riley Defense AK about 870 bucks.
So this is what happens when your 60-year-old grandfather hears they need to update a rifle. This is absolute. So anything, any of the updates, you kind of go down a rabbit hole. You know how the guys for a while, if you've ever been online, any of the gun groups, you see
Right.
the Bubba AKs or the Bubba SKSs. That's what this
Yes.
rifle looks like. It's a Rack 47. It's awful. Don't do this. It's bad.
What do you mean? It looks good. I like it. I like it.
Oh, okay. Whatever you say.
I
So I'm not a fan. So basically what we're gonna start off with is where we start. And yeah, you could start with your type ones, your type twos, your AK-47s, but for the context of this video, we're gonna stick to AKMs and out. So AKMs, AK-74s, 100s, 200s, 12s, 15s. So we're gonna run through kind of the gambit and what ended up happening through these rifles. This isn't gonna be a generational video, but it's gonna kind of go over what ends up happening with these rifles to bring them to modern-ish standards. Because for all intents and purposes, AKs are pretty well stuck in the 80s. They're not
yeah.
really changing. Once you get to your AK-200s, you start sort of seeing where they wanted to go with it. And then for whatever reason, the AK-12 and 15s just went right back to where we started. So I don't really
Well,
get it.
you know what they say. If it's not broken, don't fix it. So if it's a
Right.
tried and true proven platform, why
Right.
why try and improve on it?
Well, because the AR-60 or the 604 was great when the Air Force adopted it, but that is not what we're running around with now.
Oh God, you're bringing it back to the ARs.
Always bring back to the ARs, buddy. Yeah, so let's start with the AKM. AKM basically has no interfaces for updating in terms of how it came from the factory. It's a steel and a wood gun.
Yep.
There's iron sights, and that's all you got. Now, in
Yep.
terms of updating for the American market, there's a lot that you can go put into an AKM to bring it up to standards. You can get updated gas blocks, or I'm sorry, not gas blocks, but you can get updated furniture in terms of real gas tubes, real
Right.
hand guards, different
Right.
stocks and stock adapters. So basically, if all you have is your dad's, I don't know, uh,
Well,
import SGL or import Belgian Bulgarian rifle, there's
right.
things you can do, but there's things you have to consider, like the comb height. So in terms of how the rifle was designed, much like a G3, the rifle stock was at the height of it based on the top of the receiver to where your shoulder interfaces is based on where the iron sights are. So if you look at
Oh,
a so if you look at the AKM or
yeah,
AK-47, it's got kind of a rake on it, a
yeah,
downward rake. So that's so you can get your cheek low enough to actually see the iron sights. That doesn't really work when you start stacking EOTechs or aim points or whatever optics you want, or even more specifically, or something that's a little bit more difficult to interface with, a magnified optic, an
right,
LPVO, and or anything magnified, and especially an ACOG. It makes it even
right,
more difficult.
right,
So what you end up having to do is you have to either build up your cheek height, you can bub it together, you can put cheek risers, you can do whatever. Or what you end up having to run into is you got to rip the stock off. You have to buy an adapter, either
right,
a buffer tube adapter, you can get or any, you can get the Picatinny rails, you can use MCX adapters, but that's more money. So just to
right,
get your face high enough to bolt on any kind of modern sighting systems, you're already into some money just so that you can shoot the rifle with an optic. So what that ends up that so we're at the buttstock. So we have a new buttstock. You can put
right,
M4 adapters on. You can put buffer tubes on. That's awesome. The problem with that is you still have the cheek, the cheek well height. You're still you still need to bring your face high enough to use your red dot. So even when you update your buttstock, you still have to have a cheek riser. So that might leave you with like a Magpul Myat or a CTR stock where you can get a cheek riser. Great.
I
So
like
your
it.
face is right. So your face is higher up on the rifle. Now, things you have to think about: do you want it to fold? Do you not want it to fold? Uh, Folding rifles are cool, but at the end of the day, it's not like a make or break thing. So
I
I wouldn't.
I think it brings more you um, usefulness because if you can collapse that stock, you can store it easier. If you're in a vehicle, you can have the stock collapsed, whip it out.
Right, I agree with that. But the problem is a lot of these rifles,
Hmm.
the stocks that you're retrofitting to this rifle were never intended to fold. So what ends up happening when you do fold them, if you have a Law tactical folder, if you have any of the aftermarket buffer tube folding mechanisms,
Uh huh.
depending on the receiver size and the style of stock, it may not fold all the way. So you end up with this weird V, and it's almost as bad as if you just kept it fully extended because it's not going to be narrow, or it's not going to be narrow,
I
which is why it's in the next generation of rifle we kind of run into had
yeah.
a dedicated folding stock that goes almost flush with the end, like the triangle folder. You have a 103
Right.
clone that
Yes.
folds a lot flatter than if you had a buffer tube
Right.
folding all along to the side.
I think it's determinant on what the rifle is intended for, and
I would agree.
the original AKs were not intended for CQC at all. They're intended for battlefield,
I
long
wouldn't necessarily
distance,
call them.
medium to long distance.
I don't think folding stocks are for CQC. I think it's for storage. If you're rolling around in a truck or a tank or any means to transport troops, you're
Right.
more concerned with size. Like you're not whacking your dude in the fucking mouth with a stock. You can fold it, put it in your lap, or you're jumping out of a helo, or you're doing anything that requires you to move around and not shoot people.
Right.
So when I think folding, I don't think I'm folding the stock and going through a door. That's not really where my brain goes, and it just doesn't. It's more for storage. If I'm throwing it in a bag, or if I'm in a truck, it might seem a little bit better if I could fold the stock, throw it on a seat, or in a
Right.
bag.
Right.
So I I don't know how much emphasis I would put towards a folding stock. They're cool, really cool. Triangle folders are my favorite. A 10 or a 104 with a triangle folder is love it.
104. Do I? What do I have? 103.
103. You have the rifle length. 104 is a carbine length. 12 and a
Uh,
half inch barrel.
I like my 103
That's a great rifle. It's one of my favorite rifles. But
that I bought.
we're talking about using the rifle and folding stocks. Stocks on an AK are it's such a rabbit hole because originally there's only really been 3 or 4 dedicated stocks for AKs. You get the wire folders from the Germans or the Egyptians. You get triangle folders from the Bulgarians or the Russians, and you
What
get the
what's the
solid stocks.
over the over folder?
The underfolder.
Yeah, under my bad.
So those are like based off of your MP40s. So it's just an underfolder stock. Those fucking suck. They suck to shoot. They're really cool and very interesting to look at. I don't know if you've ever shot one, but they're
No.
awful. They're so bad. They suck so hard, but they are really cool to look at. But shooting them, I'm not a fan.
Yeah.
But they're really interesting. That would have been one of the dedicated folding stocks. That and a lot of the folding stocks that I have personally put hands on, they're tight when you first get them, but then they loosen up pretty quickly over time. That might be because they've been assembled in the US and I don't know anything about factory underfolders. I can confidently tell you I have no experience with it, so I don't know. But the ones that I have had experience with start out really nice, then they get loose, but it doesn't really matter because they suck anyway.
Right.
So, and then they have things you can do to make them suck less, or just buy a triangle folder and then just,
Right.
don't worry about it.
Okay. All right. So we're talking about modernizing the AK. Where do you start with this? Do you buy a base rifle? Do you buy a kit? What do you do?
So I would say you can, if depending on how much money you want to start with. I mean,
What?
you can
What?
get some buy a parts kit, which used to make a lot more sense because they used to be super cheap.
How
That
about
is no longer the case.
we'll cap it at say $3,000. And I feel like $3,000 is pretty decent for
I,
someone wanting to get into it but not wanting to dump, you know.
dude, I mean, honestly, I don't think you need to dump that much money into an AK project. I think you can start with a Palmetto State Armory, which I know sounds ridiculous. Start with a Palmetto State Armory AK,
Okay.
not AR.
Right.
You can start with their 100 series. You can start with their AKMs. They have interesting parts. They have interesting builds you can start with. And they have sort of updated rifles you can kind of use. I have no experience with their furniture, but start with a decent rifle. Those are decent rifles. Now, if you want to go bougie and you really want to go for it, find one of the earlier SGLs or the Bulgarian imports from Arsenal. Those are really good. They, depending on the model that you buy, they're actually
Nice.
specced out AK or specced out Russian rifles. They're not actual. I mean, they did import Russian rifles, but those are unobtainium right now. They're like 5-6 grand. So those are hard to
Oh,
find.
if my
Those are like the Ismash ones.
yes, interesting.
But they have AK-100. They have updated rifles. The primary rifles they're importing right now are going to be your SAM series, and those are milled receivers. And I think when we're talking AKs, I wouldn't really. I'm not interested in milled receivers. They're very heavy. They're very cool. I think they're really interesting, and a lot of people misunderstand that when they think AK, they're like they have to be stamped. Well, I mean, Type 1 and 2 or the earlier generations of the AK were milled. So that's not a new thing,
Right.
but I think you lose a lot in terms of maneuverability for an already heavy rifle. Stamped guns, stamped AKs are immediately out of the gate more heavy than your AR because it's mostly stamped steel, it's not aluminum. So
Right.
I think that's I, for me personally, that's not something I'm interested in. So start with a decent base rifle, and that you can go with a Palmetto State Armory. Now, if you're going from an AKM, you have to think about changing your stock out. You have to think about changing your gas tube out. You have to think about changing your handguard out. There's easy
Right.
ways to get into that. But the biggest problem for me in terms of AKs is
Right.
about a magazine and a half after you've decided to shoot. it's really hard to hold on to the rifle with your support hand. They get
Yes.
real hot real quick.
Yes. Yes. I can attest to that personally.
I know you can,
They
because
get spicy.
if your finger inches too far forward under that handguard retainer, you hear a sizzle and a really loud fuck because it hurts. It
Well,
sucks.
well, I don't say obscurities. I just deal with
Obscenities.
I just deal with the pain because the AK wanted blood that day and I gave it the blood that it wanted.
It required blood. So
Yes.
when you're shooting an AK and you just want an AKM, you just want an AK-74, you just want the basic rifles, just understand and accept either you're going to start shooting with a glove or you're going to start shooting with the understanding that there's no high volumes of fire without moving your hand to the magazine, because realistically it's just not going to happen. They get
Oh,
really hot.
what was it? The Slavic group.
Yeah, magwell grips. I mean, that's pretty common teaching in terms of the AK. So heat is a big problem. Now you can ameliorate that sort of by switching to a chassis, and that's kind of the next thing. Instead of just switching, if you want to go bare bones, you want to update optics and mounting, you can go with an Ultimac rail. That's a rail gas tube.
Yeah.
So that's helpful in terms of if you don't want to mount the optic further back by using the Russian standard mounting option in terms of the optic rail, you can put your red dot on the front on the gas tube. Now, the problem with that is it still gets hot. You're not going to grab that. It's still going to suck after a magazine because
Yeah.
it's gas tube. That's where the gas is expanding and
Yes.
pressing your piston back.
Correct.
What that also might introduce issues into, or it might cause a problem, is that depending on how much you're shooting, you're transferring all that heat up into your optic. So I'm not saying it's bad. I'm not saying it's
Right.
great, but
Right.
it's kind of a band-aid for an issue. You
Heh.
can jam a red dot on that, but it also makes the rifle kind of front heavy.
Right.
So it's not, I wouldn't say a professional level fix. Now, with that being said, people have been doing it for decades, almost decades now,
Well,
because I mean, from the
I mean,
2000s, it's not new.
the AK, it's a band-aid kind of thing, you know. You just do a band-aid
Right.
fix there, band-aid fix there, and you just keep it running.
So we started with the stock. Well, now we can talk about optics. I've already started talked about it. How do you put an optic on this? Well,
Well,
they have optics rails for your newer generation. Once you jump from the AKM to the AK-74, they have optic mounting solutions
yes.
from the factory. They're optic rails on the side of the receiver. Problem with that is if you have a folding stock, it makes it kind of hard because rifle, the stock for the rifle folds
Folds right into the optic.
right into the optic rail. So
Yep, right there.
that yep, it makes it kind of difficult. Now, unless you have one of the wire folders for like the Egyptians or the AMDs or the Romanian guns, they fold to the right side or the ejection port side.
Right.
That's not a problem, but it's a shitty stock. So, maybe not that.
Right.
But that's a great mounting option, but it takes away some of the capability in terms of folding the stock. And then on top of that, it's a bigger, it makes the rifle wider. I'm not saying it doesn't work because obviously it works, but that's one option. The second option obviously would be the gas tube, but that doesn't really work unless if you want magnified optics. It's not ideal. So the next step from there, and you're just working up the price chain, right? So you
Right.
you go gas tube. All right, well that's like 80, $90 to put something on your gas tube. And then you start working back to your updated mounting options for your optics rail. They
Right.
start going up from there. It's like 100, 150, depending on what you want: LPVO, magnified, aim point, EOTech. And then that also you start kind of introducing problems with your cheek height. So ideally, you
Right.
set your stock up correctly so that that's not really a problem. But when you start using those optic rails, they start going higher and higher and higher and
Right.
higher, and you still have the same problem. And you still need crazy cheek wells. If you look up like Russian alpha guys with EOTechs or something, it looks like basically they're putting their chin right on top of the rifle because these things are sky high.
Right.
We talk about 193s and 2-inch risers. gear, and
Yeah.
these dudes are fucking. They're not even touching their stocks. They're just they're floating their heads, fucking shooting the rifle, and that sucks.
Yeah.
That's not ideal. It's not repeatable. They make it work because it's what they have.
Right.
But if we want to go move on from there, we can talk about chassis. A chassis is a way that you can integrate a lot in kind of a, I don't know, eliminate a lot of these problems going into
Right.
modernizing the AK. The
Right.
problem is they start at about $600 and go up from there.
Oh God. Really? 600?
So the chassis that I've been following development of is something called the Sure Shot Industries. Most people know of the Zenitco rails. Those are the Russian aftermarket rails. They are made from, I don't know, the heaviest metal known to mankind, and they're heavy as hell, and they're next to impossible to find right now because of
Well,
current political and
well, they are they
world.
are they are Russian, so obviously they have to be heavy, you know.
They're heavy and overbuilt. So believe it or not, Sure Shot was originally a Russian company. They are now
Wow.
being produced here as well.
Interesting.
So it's a chassis system that basically integrates. They have different versions of this chassis, but it's a handguard system that actually feeds back into a top rail system. So basically, it feeds together. And the idea being is it's more similar to an AR.
Hmm.
The top rails hold 0 for IR for magnified optics, and it's
Right.
repeatable 0. So if you take the top cover off, you put it back on, it's not going to walk 0. There's something called the Texas Weapons Company. There's a top rail top cover it's called the dog leg. It's very common, and now they've had 3 generations of this, I believe, and every generation it seems like someone's kind of had an issue with repeatable 0 in terms of taking top cover off to replace a spring, clean it, do whatever you're going to do to it, putting it back on, and you're 0 walking. It just seems to be a common issue. I'm not saying it's not a quick fix. Like
Right.
if you wanted to set up bare bones modern AK with a light,
Yes.
Ultimac rail,
Okay.
standard handguard,
Okay.
whatever handguard you want, M-lock handguard,
Okay.
and a Texas Weapons Co. dogleg with a red dot. You're not putting magnified optics on this thing.
Right.
So bare bones rifle, you could put a light on the Ultimac rail. I wouldn't put a red dot up there. It makes it front heavy. I just wouldn't do it. And then you can find M-lock rails for handguards. So I mean, Midwest Industries, SLR, KRG, I think makes handguards for an AK.
Mhm.
So just entry level. If you want to put a light, you want to put an optic, and that's all you want to do. You're still going to have kind of problems depending on how you hold the rifle with heat. So it's something to consider, but it's an easy way to get into it. But if you want to get into the rifle, you're going to have to get a chassis, which is another $600. That's why I say you're stacking the price on this gun. It's so fast. If you want the ability to put night vision, if you want the ability to put magnified optics, if you want to do anything that you can do with an AR, you have to dump a lot of money. And the
Right.
Russians even tried to address this. They started doing these incremental updates. If you look at the AK 100 series, it
Mhm.
started out basically as an updated 74. So they started changing calibers, they started shortening the barrel, changing gas system, adding
Right.
boosters.
Mhm.
But at the end of the day, where they ended up at is the AK 200 series, which
Right.
basically looks like some dude in the US added a buffer tube, added an adjusting stock, a folding buffer tube, a railed top cover, and a railed handguard,
Right.
and a shorter rifle. So basically, the updated 200 series is what I'm telling you to do for your basic level upgrades.
Yeah.
And then for some reason, immediately after that, they were like, hey, AK 12, let's do none of those things. Let's have
And
a
go back
handguard you can move with your hand.
and go back to
Let's walk back.
yeah.
So, I,
Probably
up
money. Probably money related.
so the AK 12 as it was adopted was not what it was in development. There's an interesting developmental series on the Firearm blog. I recommend everybody watch it. one of the guys that was actually testing the generations of the AK-12 writes for the firearm blog, or did at the time of this recording, and it's really interesting. But you can see the updates they were going through, different charging handles, milled receivers, stamped, whatever you end up. But it just basically ended back at a AK-200 budget version. So if you want to update the AK, there's a lot that you have to put in, and you have to want to do it because it's so much easier to pick up another rifle, and that's the biggest problem. And then we can talk about calibers briefly. 7.62 by 3.9, it's an antiquated caliber.
It
It's
is.
it really is. I mean, it's great for 5.56 versus 7.62 by 3.9. I mean, unless you really care about barriers, 5.56 probably. And even then, 5.56 is
Well,
getting on in years. I mean, it's
no.
not the
What about
hottest.
well, you have to compare apples and oranges, so it wouldn't be 5.56 to 7.62. It'd be 5.56 to 5.45.
It would be, but in terms of ammunition availability in the U.S.,
Oh yeah, because of the current political stuff going on. Yeah,
or just the market, not even politically, I'm just looking at numbers on the market.
yeah. Well,
What's easier to find? 5.56, 7.62. Those are the
right.
easiest things to find right now.
Yes,
So if you want to update an AK and you really, really want to do it, buy a Bulgarian Arsenal rifle, put a
Bulgarian
Sure
or
Shot, put a Sure Shot Industries chassis on it,
sure, okay.
and you're at about almost $3,000. Or
Or
buy a PSA, which apparently those work as well. So the PSA AK-100 series, 104, 102, depending on your barrel length, doesn't really matter. Do the same thing. Or if you just want something you can put a light and a red dot on,
mhm,
get a rail top cover, an
yep,
Ultimac gas tube, and an M-Lock handguard if you're feeling frisky. But we kind of circle back to, is that as capable as buying a Galil, which basically updates this from the box, a solid top rail for
right.
mounting optics.
The Galil Ace,
The
right?
Galil Ace. I'm sorry. Yes, the Galil Ace. It's
Gotcha.
an AK operating system. They have them 5.56, 5.45, and 7.62. Does it make a lot of sense? Probably not. Do I really like AKs? Yep. Am I going to do the other thing? Nope. Still going to buy an AK. Still going to invest the money because I think it's kind of cool.
Nice.
So, yep, that was a long conversation just for me to say I'm going to do the dumb thing. Because
He likes
I enjoy the process. It's really interesting.
he enjoys putting round pegs in the square holes.
I really do. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Well, I apologize for the very scatterbrained episode this has turned into, but it's something I enjoy talking about, and I appreciate Kevin humoring me.
Haha! That's what I get paid to do. I mean, that's what I'm here to do.
Who's paying you?
I'm not at liberty to discuss that at this time.
My wife is bribing you to have a podcast with me.
Yes. Ooh, hey, before you get off, look at what I found on Gunbrook. The thing I'm about to send you. I've been sending you stuff the whole time. Well, look at the most recent one I just found. $40. You were talking about putting in a rail with a red dot on top.
Yep, yep, that's one of the Arsenal ones.
Yeah, $40. So for $40, you could put your toes in the water and modernize your boring old AK.
$40, you can put the interface to then put a red dot, yes, and it's still super high, which means you should ideally update your stock.
Well, we got to cobble it together. And at some point, we're going to do a video of these cobbled together rifles. And for your
I think that'd
listening
be cool.
pleasure.
It would be kind of nice is if you could do, because you know what I'm going to do. I'm going to get the chassis and I'm going to do all the things I want to do. And then I know you're not going to want to do that. So
No,
you should get the railed gas tube and the optic mount. And then we could do apples to apples. It'd be kind of cool.
I like apples.
I do too.
I will check with my financial advisor and see if I can get back to you on that.
I'll see if my wife's gonna let me.
Well, oh, hey, what is this?
All right,
What is
guys. Well, thank you so much for listening to the Carry Handle podcast. This has been a slightly more nerdy episode, but you know what? Had a
always?
good time. So, thank you so much for listening, guys, and catch us next time.
See ya.